My family laughed when I walked into my father's funeral. 10 years. 10 years they'd made it clear I wasn't welcome. But in the lawyer's hand, there was an envelope. A will. They thought they knew my story. They thought they'd written the ending. They were about to learn, the truth changes everything. The low hum of the old library fan was the soundtrack to my days in Savannah. For 10 years, this city had been my sanctuary, a gentle coastal breeze, a constant contrast to the storm I'd weathered. I'd built a life here, brick by quiet brick, for myself and Caleb. He was my world, his laughter the brightest color in our small, safe existence. Most folks at the library or the parents at Caleb's school probably saw me as just that. Rachel, the quiet librarian, Caleb's mom, always with a kind word, always a little reserved. The serenity of these days, the steady rhythm of shelving books and reading bedtime stories, it masks a resilience forged in fire, a strength that perhaps many women recognize in themselves or others. Does my journey to find peace after the storm remind you of an extraordinary woman in your own life? Someone who rebuilt everything from the ashes? I'd love to hear about her in the comments. That ordinary Tuesday, however, the rhythm broke. The mail lay scattered on the kitchen counter, mostly bills and grocery store flyers. But one envelope stood out. No return address, just my name, Rachel. Elaine Moore, scrawled across the front in a stiff, all too familiar hand. My breath hitched. I nearly tossed it with the rest of the junk, a reflexive urge to avoid anything that smelled of the past. But something, a cold premonition, made me pause. My fingers trembled as I slid a nail under the flap, already bracing myself for a wound I thought had long since scarred over. It was a funeral invitation, stark and impersonal. My father was dead. I stared at the crisp white paper, the elegant script, a cruel mockery of the coldness it conveyed. I tried to summon an appropriate emotion, shock, perhaps, or sadness, even anger. But there was nothing, just a profound, echoing stillness inside me. It had been a full decade since I'd heard a single word from the Moore family, 10 years since I'd packed a single suitcase, strapped a baby Caleb into the back seat of my battered car, and driven away from Charleston, leaving behind every judgmental glance, every whispered cruelty, every cold shoulder that had defined my existence there. They had made it abundantly, painfully clear. I wasn't one of them anymore. Not after I'd finally found the courage to leave him. I can still feel the sting of my busted lip that day, the weight of shame my father had piled onto my already broken spirit. "You made your bed," he'd said, his voice devoid of any warmth, his eyes like chips of ice. No offer of shelter, no comfort for his daughter and infant grandson fleeing a man who had broken more than just my bones. That was his final word on the matter. But I didn't crumble. Not then, not ever. I built this new life for us. Quiet, small, but undeniably safe. I found a job at the library, a haven of stories and hushed reverence. I learned how to breathe again, lulled by the cadence of bedtime stories I read to Caleb, his small hand clutching mine. And yet, even though my father never reached out, never apologized, never once asked if we were okay, a part of me, the part that was still his daughter, couldn't completely sever the tie. Every month, like clockwork, I sent money through old Mr. Gerald, our former next-door neighbor in Charleston. Just enough to ensure he had what he needed, a silent offering from a daughter he'd cast aside. I never told anyone, especially not Caleb. It was a secret I kept locked away, a quiet act of duty, or perhaps a lingering, foolish hope. Now, holding this stark white invitation, all I could think was, why? Why now? Why invite the daughter you disowned? Caleb, my perceptive, gentle boy, must have seen the turmoil on my face. He came to stand beside me, his small hand finding mine. "You going to go, Mom?" he asked quietly, his voice barely a whisper. I couldn't answer. My throat was too tight, choked with a decade of unspoken words. I just stared at the name on the paper, a name that felt like a stranger's. Then, with an innocence that belied a wisdom far beyond his years, he added, "Maybe he left more than a will, Mom. Maybe he left something for you." I looked at my son, my anchor, my constant witness, and something in me, a tiny, hesitant flicker, shifted. I didn't know what awaited me in Charleston, what fresh hell or hollow peace, but I knew this. If there was anything left to be said, anything at all, I needed to hear it. So, I folded the letter, packed our bags, and prepared to return to the place I swore I'd never see again. The chapel was smaller than I remembered, or perhaps I had just grown. Wooden beams arched overhead, and the stained glass windows, usually so vibrant in memory, were muted by a typically gray Charleston sky. It should have felt sacred, a place of solemn reflection, but the air inside was heavy, cloying, sour with the scent of old perfume and even older, more potent resentment. I hesitated at the threshold, Caleb's small hand tucked tightly into mine, his presence a silent reassurance. Taking a deep breath, I stepped through the heavy double doors. Heads turned almost immediately. A ripple of surprise, then recognition, then thinly veiled disdain, spreading through the pews before we'd even made it halfway down the aisle. Whispers flared like sparks in dry tinder, some not even bothering to hide their shock, others just staring, openly, as if they were watching a ghost materialize. And then I saw them. Lindsay and Mark, my sister and brother, stood near the front, their black clothes impeccably tailored, grief applied like a subtle, expensive makeup, just enough to be noticed, not enough to smudge or cause any real discomfort. Lindsay's eyes, sharp and assessing, locked onto mine. First, a flicker of disbelief, quickly morphing into something predatory. Her lips curved into a slow, sharp smile, a viper's welcome. "Well, well," she said, her voice a stage whisper, deliberately pitched loud enough for the surrounding pews to catch every venomous syllable. "Guess the prodigal daughter thinks there's money left." Mark, ever her echo, let out a quiet, humorless chuckle, his eyes holding only that familiar, cold judgment I had grown up under, the kind that seared and shamed. I offered no response, no acknowledgement of their venom. I just kept walking, eyes fixed forward, spine as straight as I could manage, even though every instinct screamed at me to turn, to bolt from that suffocating atmosphere. We found a seat at the far end of the last pew, the back row, as far removed from them and their poisonous orbit as possible. I hadn't come for them. I hadn't come for drama, or for a share of whatever they believed was rightfully theirs. I had come, quite simply, to say goodbye, to close a chapter I thought had been slammed shut a decade ago. Caleb slid in beside me, his small fingers clutching my hand even tighter now. I could feel the faint tremor in his grip, his unspoken anxiety mirroring my own. I leaned down slightly, whispering, "It's okay, baby. We're just here to sit, to listen." But I knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in my gut, that it wasn't okay. Not really. Not here. Not with them. From the front of the chapel, the preacher cleared his throat, a signal for the service to begin. Prayers were offered, rote and passionless. A few shaky eulogies followed, the kind of polite, rehearsed mourning that sounds hollow even to the uninitiated. They spoke of his community involvement, his business acumen, his brief, uncomplaining illness. My name, of course, wasn't mentioned once. Not a single acknowledgement that I was his daughter, that I even existed. They skipped seamlessly from his early childhood memories, straight to Lindsay's tireless, selfless care in his final days, and Mark's frequent, important business trips home to help manage things. The narrative they wove was neat, tidy, meticulously edited to exclude any inconvenient truths, any uncomfortable reminders of a daughter who had dared to walk away. My father, it seemed, had died much the way he had lived, surrounded by a story that deliberately, pointedly left me out. Caleb, bless his resilient heart, leaned his head against my shoulder, quiet and still. A small, warm weight against the chill that had settled deep in my bones. I stared straight ahead, unseeing, but my ears burned with every sideways glance. I felt every stifled snicker I caught hidden behind a delicately held tissue. I wasn't crying, not because I didn't want to, or because I felt nothing. I'd simply done all my crying years ago, a torrent of grief and betrayal that had eventually, mercifully, run dry. When the service finally, blessedly ended, people began to file out, a slow, somber procession. A few walked past me without so much as a glance. One older cousin, someone I vaguely remembered from childhood holidays, offered a stiff, almost imperceptible nod, then quickly looked away, as if acknowledging my presence was a transgression. Lindsay brushed past me as if I were invisible, a piece of the worn church furniture, her expensive perfume a suffocating cloud in her wake. Mark, however, followed a moment later, stopping just long enough to loom over me, to look me directly in the eye, his expression a mixture of contempt and smug superiority. "Didn't think you had the guts to show up," he murmured, his voice low and laced with malice. I met his gaze without flinching, holding it steady. "Neither did I replied, my own voice surprisingly even. He smirked, a truly unpleasant expression. "Don't get comfortable," he added, leaning in slightly. "It's not your story anymore." Then, he turned and walked off, rejoining Lindsay near the exit, their whispered conversation and shared, knowing glances a final parting shot. I sat frozen in that hard wooden pew, Caleb's head still resting against me, my hand wrapped tightly around his, as if he were the only real, solid thing in that entire suffocating room. They didn't know. They couldn't possibly know. I wasn't there to be in their story. I was there to finally, definitively, finish my own. The tension in that chapel was almost a physical presence, wasn't it? But the story was far from over. In fact, the most unexpected chapter was about to unfold, hidden away in a place filled with even more ghosts of the past. If you're as invested in Rachel's journey for truth and vindication as I am, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on, because you won't want to miss what happens when the will is finally read. The quiet ones often have the most powerful stories to tell. The Moore family home hadn't changed, not on the outside at least. The same imposing white columns flanked the wide porch, the same rich red brick glowed dully under the overcast Charleston sky, and the same relentless ivy curled its way up the porch railings, looking as if it were slowly, methodically choking, something precious beneath its green tendrils. It had been 10 years, a lifetime since I'd last stepped onto that porch. But as I walked through the familiar heavy front door after Caleb, it felt like walking into a freezer. The air was cold, sterile, and silent in all the wrong, unsettling ways. The house, once a place of stifled laughter and unspoken rules, now felt like a mausoleum, grand and empty. The guests, or rather the mourners, had already begun to gather for the post-funeral reception. Cousins I vaguely recognized, their faces etched with the passage of time and polite, somber expressions. Old neighbors, their eyes flicking towards me with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. A few of my father's business partners, men in dark suits who nodded curtly in my general direction but avoided direct eye contact. I recognized most of the faces, though none of them looked at me directly for more than a fleeting second. Their conversations, which had been a low murmur upon our arrival, dropped to hushed whispers the moment I stepped into the formal parlor. I could feel every sideways glance like a pinprick on my skin, a familiar sensation from a childhood spent trying to be invisible. Lindsay, naturally, held court near the grand marble fireplace, swirling a glass of white wine with a practiced, almost celebratory air. She looked less like a grieving daughter and more like the hostess of a slightly macabre cocktail party. Mark leaned casually beside her, one hand tucked with feigned nonchalance into his blazer pocket, the other holding a matching glass, his filled with red. They were a matched set, perfectly composed, perfectly contemptuous. When they saw Caleb and me enter, Mark's mouth twisted into that same unpleasant, knowing grin I'd seen in the chapel. "Well, this won't take long," he announced, his voice carrying easily across the suddenly quiet room, clearly intending for at least half the guests to hear. "She got cut out years ago. This is just a formality." A few people chuckled, a dry, uncomfortable sound. Others turned away abruptly, suddenly finding the floral arrangements or the pattern on the wallpaper intensely fascinating. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say that they would or could hear. I kept my coat on, a subconscious barrier, against the chill of the room and the people in it, even though a fire was crackling merrily in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the polished wood floors. Caleb stayed close, very close to my side, his small fingers still clutched tightly around mine. He didn't say a word, but I could feel his eyes, wide and observant, scanning the room, watching every subtle movement, reading the palpable tension in the air the way only a child who has lived through his share of silences and storms knows how. He was my silent, steadfast protector, my small warrior in a battle I hadn't chosen. We took a seat on a stiff-backed settee near the back of the parlor, far from the warmth of the hearth and the clinking of wine glasses. My gaze drifted around the room, soaking in the framed photographs that still lined the mahogany-paneled walls. Lindsay in her college graduation gown, beaming. Mark on a sailboat. The picture of confident leisure. Family vacations to Hilton. Head, everyone smiling, perfectly posed. There was not a single picture of me. Not one. Not even from when we were children, before the fractures in our family had become irreparable chasms. I wasn't surprised, not really. I had been erased with cold, calculated precision, expunged from the family record as thoroughly as if I'd never existed. Lindsay, sensing my gaze perhaps, caught my eye and offered a smile. It was not a kind smile. It was territorial, proprietary, the smile of a queen surveying an unwelcome intruder in her kingdom. "You can sit if you want, Rachel," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, a saccharine coating over a core of pure malice. "But don't expect a chapter in the family history. That book's closed." I gave her nothing in return, no flicker of emotion, no acknowledgement of her petty cruelty. Caleb, however, looked up at me then, his small face serious, and I saw it clearly in his eyes. Not fear, not confusion, but a strange, unwavering focus. It was as if he was waiting, patiently, for something important, something pivotal, that hadn't happened yet. And somehow, with a certainty that defied logic, I knew he was right. The air crackled with unspoken words, with years of resentment, but underneath it all, there was a sense of anticipation, as if the true purpose of this gathering was yet to be revealed. The room, already thick with an awkward simmering tension, fell into an even deeper hush when the heavy front door creaked open again. Every head turned, expecting perhaps another late-arriving relative or family friend. Instead, Thomas Dawson, my father's longtime lawyer, stepped into the foyer and then into the parlor. He moved like a man who knew exactly what kind of hornet's nest he was walking into, his demeanor calm, professional, and utterly unruffled. He wore the same crisp gray suit I remembered from years ago, carried the same worn leather briefcase, but this time he carried something else too, a small, polished, cedar box clutched tightly under one arm. It looked old and somehow significant. Lindsay barely looked up from her wine, her expression one of bored impatience. Mark, ever the important businessman, glanced ostentatiously at his watch, as if he had a flight to catch or a boardroom, waiting. He exuded an air of someone who considered this whole affair a tedious, time-consuming obligation. Mr. Dawson, however, paid them no mind. He surveyed the room with a neutral gaze, his eyes briefly meeting mine with a flicker of something unreadable, recognition, perhaps, or even a hint of sympathy. "Thank you all for being here," Mr. Dawson said, his voice low but commanding, easily cutting through the strained silence. Per Mr. Moore's specific instructions, we will begin with a video message he prepared, before moving on to the formal reading of the will. The air in the room shifted, tightened. You could almost hear the collective intake of breath. "A video?" Lindsay scoffed, her carefully constructed composure finally cracking, revealing the irritation beneath. "Seriously? Can't we just get to the will? We all know what it says or what it should say." She shot a pointed, venomous look in my direction. Mark nodded in agreement, his tone brusque. "Yeah, Thomas. Let's not drag this out. Some of us have actual lives to get back to, flights to catch." His dismissiveness was palpable, his arrogance breathtaking. But Mr. Dawson didn't flinch, didn't react to their blatant disrespect. He walked past them with a calm, deliberate pace and set the cedar box carefully on the heavy mahogany coffee table in front of the fireplace. Then, he placed his briefcase next to it and began to slowly, methodically open the brass latches. "It was your father's express and unequivocal wish," Mr. Dawson stated, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument, "that this video be viewed by all present before any legal matters are addressed or discussed." Lindsay rolled her eyes dramatically, making a small, exasperated sound. Mark muttered something derogatory under his breath, clearly unimpressed and annoyed. A few of the cousins, however, leaned forward slightly in their chairs, their curiosity visibly piqued in spite of themselves. A video message from beyond the grave? It was undeniably intriguing, a piece of unexpected drama in an otherwise predictable, somber affair. I stayed quiet, a knot forming in my stomach. A video? What could my father possibly have to say, after a decade of silence, that he couldn't have said while he was alive? What words, what final pronouncements had he deemed so important that they needed to be delivered in this way? Beside me, Caleb sat up a little straighter, his small body tense with anticipation. His grip on my hand, which had been a constant pressure, loosened just slightly. I looked down at him, at his soft, open face, and I saw it again. That quiet, unmistakable flicker of hope, a gentle light in his innocent eyes. He didn't say a word, but I could feel it radiating from him. A sense of quiet knowing, as if he'd been waiting for this exact moment, perhaps even longer than I had. And for the first time since I had walked into that cold, unwelcoming house, for the first time since I'd stepped back into the suffocating atmosphere of my past, I didn't feel entirely alone. There was Caleb, my steadfast anchor. And now, there was this unexpected, unknown element, a message from the man who had cast me out. Mr. Dawson finished with his briefcase, retrieved a small, discreet remote, and gestured towards the large, dark television screen mounted above the mantelpiece. The room held its breath. The fire crackled, the only sound for a long moment. Then, the screen flickered once, then again, before settling into focus. A faint electronic hum filled the silence, and then, there he was. My father. My father. He looked older than I remembered, significantly so, and thinner too. The proud, almost arrogant set of his shoulders, a feature so ingrained in my memory, had slumped, softened into something that looked like weariness or perhaps defeat. His eyes, always so sharp, so quick to judge, so chillingly cold when they'd last rested on me, were tired now, shadowed beneath a weight I couldn't quite name, a burden that seemed to have settled deep within him. He sat at his old, imposing oak desk, the one that had always been strictly off-limits to everyone but him, a symbol of his authority and his distance. Behind him, the familiar painting of the saltwater marsh, a scene from my childhood, still hung on the wall, unchanged, a silent witness to the passage of time and the erosion of family. He looked directly into the camera, not at anyone in particular, but as if he were trying to meet my gaze across the years. "If Rachel is watching this," he began, his voice low, gravelly, unfamiliar yet achingly familiar at the same time. Every breath in the room seemed to freeze, caught in a collective moment of suspended animation. I felt Caleb's hand instinctively tighten around mine again. "I owe you," my father continued, his gaze unwavering, "the apology I never gave." The words hung in the air, heavy, almost unbelievable. I felt a strange pressure build behind my eyes. "I was wrong," he said, the admission stark, unadorned. "I judged you harshly for leaving a marriage I didn't understand, a situation I never bothered to truly see. I thought you were weak. I thought you were selfish. I let myself believe what I wanted to believe, what was convenient for my narrative, because it was easier than asking the hard questions, easier than facing truths I wasn't ready or willing to hear." He paused, his fingers twitching slightly in his lap, a nervous, uncharacteristic tick I'd never seen before. It made him seem, for a fleeting moment, vulnerable. "When you showed up on my porch that night," he went on, his voice softer now, tinged with a regret that felt raw, bruised, shaking with your baby in your arms. "I should have opened the door wide. I should have pulled you inside and held you and said, 'You're safe now. You're home.'" A lump, sharp and painful, formed in my throat. Caleb reached for my hand again, his little fingers folding trustingly into mine. I couldn't, take my eyes off the screen, off the face of the man who had caused me so much pain, yet whose words were now, impossibly, beginning to soothe a wound I thought would never heal. "But I didn't," he confessed, the words heavy, with self-reproach. "I let pride, that damn more pride, speak louder than love. I let anger and disappointment cloud my judgment. I told myself I was doing the right thing," he continued, his voice raspy, "that I was teaching you about responsibility, about consequences. But the truth is, Rachel, the hard, ugly truth, is that I was punishing you for leaving, for choosing yourself, for daring to be stronger, more courageous than I ever taught you to be, stronger than I had ever been." Behind me, I heard the subtle, uncomfortable shifting of chairs, someone exhaling a little too loudly, a rustle of fabric. But I didn't turn. I couldn't. Not now. All my focus was on the man on the screen, on the words tumbling out of him, words I had longed to hear for a decade, words I had given up all hope of ever hearing. "I found out the truth, Rachel," he said, his gaze intense. "A few years ago, old Mr. Gerald, bless his discreet heart, came by with an envelope. Said it was from an anonymous friend who wanted to help cover the heating bill that winter. The handwriting on the note inside? Well, it didn't take a detective long to figure it out." He leaned forward slightly then, his eyes, though tired, glinting with a new, surprising light. "You sent money, every single month for years, quietly, with no expectation of credit, no contact, just care. Even when I gave you nothing but silence and rejection in return. Even when I pretended to the world and to myself that you didn't exist. You never stopped being my daughter, Rachel. even when I had long since stopped acting like your father. My breath hitched in my chest. I blinked hard, fiercely, trying to keep the tears that were welling up from falling, but they were already there, hot, fast, and silent, tracing paths down my cheeks. I didn't bother to wipe them away. I watched you from a distance, he continued, his voice thick with emotion. Gerald kept me informed, reluctantly at first, then with a certain quiet pride. He told me how you were doing, about your job at the library, about Caleb. He said Caleb was a bright one, a good boy. Said he looks at the world with the same patience, the same quiet observation that you always did. He smiled then, a small, tired, almost broken smile, and it was that smile, more than anything, that finally broke me. The tears came freely now. I don't deserve your forgiveness, Rachel. I know that, he said, his voice cracking. But if I can leave you with anything at all, let it be this. I was profoundly wrong. You were right. You did what I should have done a long time ago for your mother, for myself. You protected your child. You walked away from pain, from abuse, and you built something good, something better, on your own terms. He drew in a shaky, audible breath. I don't want to be remembered as the man who turned his back on his own daughter. So I've changed the will. They don't know yet. But they will. Gasps, sharp and startled, fluttered around the room like a flock of disturbed birds. Someone behind me cursed audibly under their breath. I felt, more than saw, Lindsay shift sharply in her seat, Mark's jaw visibly tensing. I barely heard them. All I had ever wanted, my father said, his voice regaining a sliver of its old strength, was to be proud of my children. And I am, Rachel. I am so incredibly proud of you, of the woman you became when I wasn't looking, when I was too blind and stubborn to see. The screen dimmed for a long moment, then lit back up, his face filling it one last time, his final words almost a whisper. Tell Caleb thank you. Thank you for giving me one last chance to be a grandfather, even if it was only from a distance. Then everything went black. Silence fell, thicker than grief, heavier than any unshed tear. No one dared to speak. But for the first time in 10 long, silent years, I heard my father. Loud and clear. The television screen had barely gone dark, plunging the room back into a heavy, charged silence when the murmurs began. Not whispers this time, but a low, agitated hum of confusion, disbelief, and burgeoning anger. It was as if my father's final words had shattered a carefully constructed illusion, and the pieces were now clattering around them. Lindsay looked poleaxed, her face a mask of stunned outrage, her wine glass trembling precariously in her hand. Mark was ramrod straight, his complexion mottled, his knuckles white where he gripped the arms of his chair. The cousins and other guests exchanged wide-eyed, incredulous glances, their polite, somber facades crumbling. Mr. Dawson, however, didn't wait for the rising tide of discontent to crest. He calmly adjusted his glasses, exuding an air of imperturbable professionalism, and opened the stiff leather folder that had been resting on his lap. The video, Mr. Dawson announced, his voice clear and steady, cutting through the rising disquiet, was intended to provide necessary context as per Mr. Moore's explicit instructions. He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the stunned faces in the room, his expression unreadable. Now, he continued, his tone becoming more formal, more official. Per Mr. Daniel Moore's revised, notarized, and legally binding last will and testament, dated 2 years prior to his passing, I will read the final allocations of his estate. Lindsay let out a sharp, audible breath through her nose, a sound like a cornered animal preparing for a fight. Mark, regaining a sliver of his usual arrogance, folded his arms tightly across his chest, and leaned back in his chair, a smug, disbelieving smirk playing on his lips, as if the video had been a mere theatrical prelude, meaning nothing in the grand legal scheme of things. He clearly believed this was still his show, his inheritance, his victory. "To my beloved daughter, Rachel Elaine Moore," Mr. Dawson began, his voice steady, formal, each word landing with deliberate weight in the suddenly silent room. I felt every eye in that parlor turn towards me, necks practically snapping with the speed of their disbelief. My hands, which had been trembling, were now frozen in my lap, Caleb's small hand still tucked safely inside mine. I could feel the heat of their collective stare, a mixture of shock, envy, and dawning comprehension. Dawson continued, his voice unwavering. "I leave the Charleston family residence, located at 17 Willow Oak Lane, its entire contents, both personal and material, and all surrounding land and properties, in full and unencumbered." A collective gasp, louder this time, rippled through the room. It was a physical shockwave. I felt my own breath catch, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The house. This house. My mind struggled to process the words. The silence that followed was so profound, so absolute, you could have heard a pin drop on the thick Persian rug. In addition, Mr. Dawson continued, his voice relentless, "I leave to Rachel Elaine Moore the sum of $250,000 in liquid assets to be drawn from my primary investment accounts and all remaining balances in my private, retirement and savings portfolios." The air in the room seemed to crackle, to thin, as if the oxygen was being sucked out. He wasn't done. The lawyer paused, perhaps for dramatic effect, or perhaps simply to allow the weight of his words to settle. He then turned a page in the leather-bound folder. "And to her son, my grandson, Caleb Moore," Mr. Dawson read, his voice softening, almost imperceptibly. "I leave a fully funded college education trust to be managed by his mother, Rachel Moore, in the initial amount of $100,000. My heart didn't just skip a beat. It felt like it stopped entirely for a moment, then restarted with a painful jolt. Caleb blinked up at me, his mouth slightly agape, his young mind clearly trying to grapple with the magnitude of those words, the sheer unexpectedness of it all. I was still trying too, my thoughts reeling, a whirlwind of disbelief and a dawning, overwhelming sense of something I couldn't yet name. Gratitude? Vindication? Or just pure unadulterated shock? Dawson paused again, a brief, significant silence, then flipped to what was clearly the final page of the document. The tension in the room was now a palpable, almost unbearable thing. "And finally," Mr. Dawson stated, his voice returning to its neutral, formal tone, "to my son, Mark Daniel Moore, and to my daughter, Lindsay Caroline Moore Smythe." He paused, and I saw Lindsay lean forward, a predatory gleam in her eye, a flicker of hope, or perhaps just greed, rekindled. Mark, too, seemed to brace himself, his smug expression returning. "I leave the following," Dawson continued, "jointly, to be divided as they see fit. My complete collection of family photo albums, spanning from my childhood to the present day. My old military compass, which guided me safely through many a difficult journey. And the leather-bound King James Bible given to me by my own dear mother when I turned 18 years of age." A choked gasp escaped from someone across the room, sharp and incredulous. It might have been Lindsay herself. The silence that followed that pronouncement was deafening, absolute, and utterly, devastatingly final for two people in that room. The silence stretched, taut and brittle, for what felt like an eternity before it shattered. Lindsay shot to her feet, her chair scraping harshly against the polished wooden floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the stunned quiet. "What?" Her voice was a shriek, sharp, high-pitched and already shaking with a potent mixture of disbelief and fury. That's not possible. There must be some mistake. This is a joke, a cruel, sick joke." Her face was flushed a deep, unbecoming red, her carefully applied composure utterly decimated. She looked wildly around the room, as if expecting someone, anyone, to corroborate her outrage, to declare this whole proceeding an elaborate, unfunny prank. "There is no mistake, Mrs. Mooresmythe," Mr. Dawson said, his voice calm, unbothered. A stark contrast to Lindsay's rising hysteria. He didn't even look up from the documents. "Your father amended his will 2 years ago. All documents are certified, witnessed by impartial parties, and properly registered with the county probate court. Everything is in perfect legal order." Mark, too, was on his feet now, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might crack. He advanced a step towards the lawyer, his posture aggressive, his eyes blazing. "He was sick," Mark spat out, his voice a low, dangerous snarl. "He didn't know what he was doing. He was clearly manipulated, coerced. This is elder abuse." "On the contrary, Mr. Moore," Mr. Dawson replied, finally closing the leather folder with a soft, definitive snap. He met Mark's furious gaze with an unwavering, steady calm. "At the time of the amendment, your father was of perfectly sound mind and body. We have medical evaluations on file to attest to that fact, should it become necessary. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he was very clear, very precise about his intentions." There was a moment of stunned, almost breathless silence as the finality of the lawyer's words sank in. Then Mr. Dawson spoke again, his voice softer this time, as he picked up a small handwritten note that had been attached to the will with a simple paperclip. "He also asked me," Mr. Dawson said, his gaze briefly, almost imperceptibly, flicking towards me, "to read this aloud after the main allocations." He cleared his throat. "Let them remember," Mr. Dawson read from the note, my father's familiar, spiky handwriting visible even from where I sat. "Who showed up when it truly mattered? Let them remember who stayed quiet, who asked for nothing, but never stopped loving, never stopped caring. This house, this legacy, should belong to the one person who never once asked for anything from me, and yet gave everything she could anyway." The words, my father's final poignant justification, hung in the air, a quiet testament to a truth only he and I and old Mr. Gerald had known. Lindsay, her face a mask of contorted rage and disbelief, let out a strangled sob and without another word stormed from the room, her heels clicking furiously on the hardwood floor, the sound echoing her uncontrolled fury. Mark lingered for a moment longer, his face a battleground of conflicting emotions, anger, humiliation, and a dawning, bitter understanding. He looked at me then, a long, hard stare filled with a decade's worth of resentment, now amplified, 1,000-fold. He opened his mouth as if to speak, to unleash a torrent of accusations or threats, but then seemed to think better of it. Perhaps he saw the futility, or perhaps Mr. Dawson's unyielding presence deterred him. With a final, contemptuous glare, he turned and followed his sister, dragging his shattered expectations and disbelief like a heavy, invisible shadow behind him. I didn't move. I couldn't. Not because I was in shock, though a part of me certainly was, but because, for the first time in 10 long, painful years, for the first time since I had been cast out and erased, I didn't feel invisible. I felt seen. I felt chosen. The remaining guests, the cousins and old acquaintances began to murmur amongst themselves, their hushed tones a mixture of awe, discomfort, and perhaps a touch of schadenfreude. Some started to quietly slip away, avoiding eye contact, eager to escape the lingering tension and the raw, uncomfortable emotions that had been laid bare. They had come expecting a somber, predictable reading of a will, perhaps with some minor family drama. They had gotten a reckoning. They thought they had buried me 10 years ago, dismissed me as a footnote in the Moore family saga. But I was still here. And now, ironically, they were the ones running, fleeing from a truth that had, finally, irrevocably come to light. The balance had shifted, not just legally, but cosmically. The story had found its true protagonist. This was the moment, wasn't it? The turning point where everything changes. But what happens after the storm, after the vindication? How do you pick up the pieces and build a new future on the foundations of such a dramatic revelation? If you're finding Rachel's journey as compelling as I am, hit that like button to show your support and let me know you're here for the next chapter. The fight might be over, but the healing is just beginning. The room was quiet now, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. Not the awkward, strained silence of unspoken resentments, nor the tense, charged quiet of anticipation. This was a still, settled quiet, the kind that comes after a great storm has passed, leaving behind a landscape irrevocably altered. I stayed where I was for a long moment, Caleb still a comforting, solid presence beside me, his small hand resting, gently in mine. His grip had loosened, but he hadn't let go. Neither had I. There was no one else left in the grand parlor. The murmur of retreating voices had faded down the long hallway, doors had clicked softly shut, and the sound of hurried footsteps on the porch had disappeared into the gray Charleston afternoon. We were alone, Caleb and I, in the vast silent house that was now, incredibly, mine. Slowly, as if moving through water, I rose from the stiff settee. My legs felt a little unsteady, but my resolve was firm. I walked, not towards the door to follow the fleeing remnants of my estranged family, but deeper into the room, towards the familiar corner where the old leather reading chair sat tucked beneath the wide bay window. It was still there, unchanged by the years or the drama that had just unfolded. The leather was faded and cracked at the arms. The seat cushion bore the distinct impression of the man who had spent countless hours there, and I knew, without needing to test it, that it would still creak at the joints if I sat down. It was worn into the shape of the man who had once called it his throne, his sanctuary. I stared at it for a long second, a lifetime of complicated memories, of distance and duty, of pain and a strange, persistent love swirling within me. Then, I reached down and gently, almost reverently, brushed my fingertips along the worn, smooth leather of the top edge. "Goodbye, Dad," I whispered, the words soft in the stillness of the room. "I forgive you." The words didn't catch in my throat, as I had always imagined they would. They didn't burn or twist with bitterness. They just landed softly, quietly, like they had been waiting patiently for a very long time to be spoken, to be released. And with their release, a profound sense of peace, a lightness I hadn't realized I was missing, settled over me. Behind me, Caleb didn't speak. He didn't need to. He understood, in that intuitive way children often do, the gravity and the grace of the moment. The fireplace crackled softly, its warm orange glow casting dancing shadows over the room, illuminating the rich wood paneling, the rows of books, the photographs on the mantelpiece, photographs I now saw not as symbols of my exclusion, but as relics of a past that no longer had the power to wound me. Even the air itself felt different now. Not hostile, not heavy with unspoken accusations or the weight of history, but just calm, cleansed. I turned slowly, taking in the entirety of the room, then looking through the wide archway into the dining room and beyond, to the glimpse of the staircase leading to the upper floors. For the first time in so many years, this house didn't feel like a place that had banished me, a monument to my rejection. It felt like a home that had finally, after a long, troubled silence, exhaled. A home that was, perhaps, waiting to be filled with new memories, with laughter, with life. Maybe some ghosts don't ever truly leave, I thought. Maybe they just wait, patiently, for the right words to be spoken, for the truth to set them, and us free. And I had finally, after all this time, said mine. The weight of a decade, the burden of unspoken grief and unresolved anger, had lifted. It was a strange, almost disorienting feeling, this sudden lightness. The legal documents Mr. Dawson had left neatly stacked on the coffee table represented more than just property and assets. They represented a chance, a new beginning, a validation I had stopped believing I would ever receive. Caleb came to stand beside me, slipping his hand back into mine, his eyes shining with a quiet understanding. We stood there together, mother and son, on the cusp of an unknown future, in a house that was suddenly, unexpectedly, ours. The silence was no longer empty, it was filled with possibility. It's a powerful thing, forgiveness, isn't it? Not just for the person being forgiven, but for the one who chooses to let go. Rachel's journey to this point has been fraught with pain, but also with incredible strength. If her story of resilience and quiet dignity resonates with you, consider sharing this video with someone who might find inspiration in her courage. Sometimes, the greatest victories are the ones fought in silence, and the sweetest peace comes after the longest storm. The house was now hers, but what would she do with this unexpected inheritance, this legacy of a complicated love? Weeks later, the old Moore house, my house now, a thought that still brought a faint tremor of disbelief, was quiet in a different way. It wasn't the strained, heavy silence of before, nor the stunned stillness after the reading of the will. This was the kind of quiet that comes after a storm has truly passed, not the quiet of destruction, but the gentle stillness of aftermath, of nascent peace. The oppressive weight that had once seemed embedded in the very walls had lifted, replaced by a sense of calm, of tentative new beginnings. The ghosts, if they were still there, seemed to be resting, content. Caleb, with the boundless adaptability of youth, had claimed the bright, airy sunroom overlooking the sprawling backyard as his personal art studio. Every morning, I'd find him there, sketchpad propped on his knees, tongue peeking out from the corner of his mouth in concentration as he meticulously shaded the wings of a cardinal, the crest of a blue jay, or the delicate form of a wren. The backyard, with its ancient, gnarled oak trees and overgrown rose bushes, had become his endless source of inspiration. His soft, bright laughter sometimes echoed through the long hallway, filling spaces that used to ache with emptiness, chasing away the last lingering shadows of the past. It was a sound that was slowly, surely, breathing new life into the old house. We moved slowly, deliberately, making the space our own. We didn't try to erase every trace of my father, or of the family that had once lived there. That would have felt wrong somehow. Instead, we began to gently weave our own lives into the existing fabric of the house. Caleb's colorful drawings started appearing on the refrigerator, held up by whimsical magnets. My collection of well-loved books found a home on a few empty shelves in the library, nestled amongst my father's older, leather-bound volumes. We opened windows that had been closed for years, letting in fresh air and sunlight, chasing away the stale scent of old regrets. One morning, amidst the usual stack of mail, there was a plain white envelope. No return address, but I recognized the familiar, slightly shaky handwriting immediately. It was from Mr. Gerald Adams, our old neighbor, the quiet conduit of my secret support and my father's eventual enlightenment. I opened it carefully, my hands surprisingly steady. The note inside was brief, written on a simple piece of lined paper, but its impact was profound. "He cried, Rachel," the note read, Mr. Gerald's words stark and direct. "The day he finally realized it was you sending the money, the day he understood." I'd never seen your father look so small, so broken. He carried that truth, and the weight of his regret, with him until the very end. He wanted you to know that. I folded the letter slowly, carefully, and tucked it into the pocket of my cardigan. I stepped out onto the wide front porch, the one I had once fled in shame and fear. Caleb sat on the top step, his sketchpad balanced on his knees, entirely absorbed in capturing the fierce intensity of a hawk he'd spotted circling high above the oak trees. I looked out over the expansive front lawn, the ancient oaks swaying gently in the morning breeze, their leaves dappled with sunlight. The world felt different, clearer. He saw me in the end, I said aloud, my voice soft, not directed at Caleb, or at anyone in particular. It was a simple statement of fact, a quiet acknowledgement of a truth that had finally found its way home. The girl they had tried to erase, the daughter they had dismissed and disowned, hadn't disappeared. She hadn't broken. She had simply been waiting, patiently, steadfastly, for the truth to catch up, for the story to find its rightful ending, or perhaps its true beginning. This house, once a symbol of my rejection, was now a testament to a complicated, imperfect, but ultimately enduring love. It was a legacy not of wealth or status, but of forgiveness, of redemption, and of the enduring strength found in quiet acts of kindness and unwavering integrity. It was a place where Caleb and I could finally, truly, be home. And so, a new chapter began, not with a grand pronouncement, but with the gentle rustle of sketch paper, the scent of brewing coffee, and the quiet hum of a house slowly awakening to a brighter future. The past was not forgotten, but it no longer held us captive. It was simply part of the story, the foundation upon which we would build something new, something beautiful, something ours.